The briefcase. A corroded metal briefcase, hidden for 30 years. A mayor on tape, handing cash to a dead man. 500,000 people watching Mark Peterson's live stream as the conspiracy unravels. And the gun to his head belongs to someone he trusted. 13 hours earlier, the boot was caked with Boise mud, dried and cracked in the corners. Mark Peterson shifted his weight, feeling the give in the rotting floorboards of the Victorian house, a structure marked for demolition in 72 hours. His supervisor had assigned him to salvage work on the Boise outskirts. Pull anything worth keeping, torch the rest, standard job, standard pay, nothing standard about what happened next. A heavy work boot, Wolverine brand, broken in at the heel. Mark kicked at a loose board in the corner of the parlor. The wood had been soft for decades, vulnerable, waiting for pressure. It splinters under his sole with a cracking sound that echoes through the empty house. The board lifts. Beneath it, darkness. A cavity. A void. Wind whistled through the broken window. Dust clouds swirled in the shaft of late afternoon light. 5:30 p.m., overcast. The sun already retreating behind the foothills. Mark reached into the hole. His fingers found texture. Cold, metallic, textured. He heaved upward with both hands. A silver Halliburton briefcase emerged from the dirt, wrapped in thick black cobwebs that came away like funeral shroud. He carried it to the window, set it on his lap as he sat back on his heels. His thumb worked the dust from a label on the side. Duct tape, black ink. The label read, "Property of City Planning, 1994. Mark pulled a screwdriver from his belt. Yellow handle. He jammed it into the latch, one sharp twist of his wrist. The metal snapped open with a loud, definitive crack. Metal shavings flew. The lid swung inward. 6 VHS tapes. A collection of hand-drawn maps showing the Boise Aquifer in faded blue ink. And a red-bound ledger with Peterson written in gold leaf across the spine. Mark picked up a map. His hands trembled as he traced the lines, the school district's well system, intricate diagrams of underground pipes and intake valves. Large red X marks circled over the water inlets to Idaho Heights High, his school, where he'd worked as a janitor for 14 years. Behind the maps, photographs, all labeled with dates from 1994, all showing the same place, a water treatment facility, and in every photograph, the same man in a lab coat. The nameplate read, Samuel Peterson, Chief Hydrologist. Samuel, his father's name. Mark's breath hitched. His father had died in a hit-and-run in 1995. A single car accident on a wet road outside the city. Case closed. The reporting officer had signed off on it in the file Mark kept in his apartment, a dusty folder from the library microfilm reader he'd reviewed twice in his life, wanting to understand how a man could be alive one moment and scattered across asphalt the next. The light was fading. Mark stood, the briefcase clutched against his ribs, and walked toward the driveway, where his beat-up Ford F-150 sat waiting. A black SUV screamed around the corner of the dirt driveway at 6:15 p.m., tires spitting gravel into the air. The headlights were bright, cutting through the dust like twin blades. Mark froze in the beams. A man in a tactical vest leaped from the passenger door before the SUV fully stopped. He lunged at Mark, reaching for the briefcase. Mark swung the heavy metal case like a club, catching the man in the temple. The thud of metal on bone was unmistakable. The man's feet left the ground. The second man slammed into Mark from the side, pinning him against the truck's driver's side door. Mark's head bounced off the window glass, spiders webbing the pane. He drove a knee into the man's groin. The assailant's grip loosened. Mark grabbed the man's head and slammed it against the Ford's side mirror. The mirror snapped off, hanging by a wire. The man collapsed into the mud. Mark fumbled with his keys, hands shaking violently. He jammed the key into the ignition and floored the gas. The Ford's rear tires spun, caught traction, launched the truck forward. The vehicle clipped the SUV's bumper. Behind him, a voice was shouting. Radios crackled. But the engine roared, and the truck pulled away, dust billowing in the headlights of vehicles now turning to follow. Mark drove hard through the outskirts of Boise, checking his mirror obsessively. The traffic thinned as he hit the residential streets. He'd lost them by the time he reached his apartment building in the Central District. 4 stories, aging brick, the kind of place where the walls were thin and the neighbors minded their own business. He carried the briefcase inside at 7:45 p.m. His apartment was small, a studio with a kitchenette, a single bed, and a television from 2005 that still had a VCR player attached. Mark shoved one of the dusty VHS tapes into the Magnavox. The player hummed and clicked. The CRT television flickered to life. Static gave way to a grainy, green-tinted night vision recording. On the screen, a younger version of Mayor Miller sat in a dark car. Recognizable, unmistakable. He was handing a thick envelope of cash to a man in a lab coat. The date on the bottom read OCT 12, 1994. The audio was muffled but intelligible. "The runoff from the plant stays in the North Aquifer," Mayor Miller said, his voice cold and commanding. "Label it as agricultural runoff and bury the tests." Mark leaned closer to the screen. The nameplate on the lab coat read, Samuel Peterson, Chief Hydrologist. His father. Mark flipped open the red ledger. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely turn the pages. He found an entry dated OCT 13, 1994. A single handwritten sentence in elegant cursive. "I refused the money. They said they'd make me disappear like the data." The clock on the wall ticked past 8 p.m. Mark was still reading when he heard it, a soft scrape at his front door. He looked at the brass handle. It was moving. Slowly, deliberately. The deadbolt lock hadn't been engaged. He glanced at the security camera in the corner of the library. The red power light was blinking. The camera was rotating directly toward him. They knew he was there. Mark grabbed the briefcase and ran toward the fire escape. The door exploded inward at 8 around p.m., hinging off the frame. A flashbang grenade skittered across the floor. The blast was deafening, a white light so bright it burned the insides of his eyelids. Mark dived over the back of his sofa, shielding his eyes. His ears were ringing. A man in a black tactical balaclava stepped through the smoke. Mark grabbed a heavy glass lamp from the side table and hurled it. The lamp shatters against the man's chest, with sparking electricity coursing through the base. A second assailant came through the broken door frame. Mark tackled him, driving him through the open window onto the iron fire escape. They both hit the metal grating with a bone-jarring clang. Rain was falling hard now, slicking the metal surfaces. Wind whipped through the alley. The assailant tried to draw a knife. Mark grabbed the man's wrist and slammed it against the sharp edge of the iron railing. The knife fell 5 stories to the alley below. Mark delivered a headbutt that dazes the attacker, then grabbed the briefcase, which he'd strapped to his back during the dive, and started sliding down the fire escape ladder. A third man was inside the room, shooting. Crack, 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 crack. Bullets struck metal with high-pitched shrieks. Sparks flew. Mark moved faster, his feet barely touching the rungs, his hands sliding down the wet iron poles. The rain hammered down around him. At street level he ran. Boise Public Library. 9:30 p.m. Mark slipped through the basement entrance, a staff door he'd known about since high school. The restricted archives section was in the back, behind a heavy oak door marked for staff only. He moved through the stacks, his clothes dripping. Sarah found him in the microfilm section. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. She'd worked at the library for 30 years. She'd known Mark's father decades ago, back when the water systems were being built. She'd asked very few questions when Mark had shown up at the library, soaking wet and terrified. Now she pulled him into the restricted archives section. The heavy oak door locked behind them. Her hands were already scanning the ledger. "What is this?" she whispered. Mark didn't answer. He was hunched over a microfilm reader, scrolling through high-speed newspapers. He stopped on a headline from 1995. "Local hydrologist dies in hit and run. Case closed." The photo showed his father's face, younger, confident. The byline was dated March 15th, 1995. Sarah pointed to a name at the bottom of the hit-and-run police report. Officer D. Miller, chief of police now, the mayor's brother. Mark's phone vibrated on the wooden desk. A news alert. Wanted. Mark Peterson for assault and theft. Armed and dangerous. His mugshot was there, an old DUI from 10 years ago, grainy and unflattering. "They're framing you," Sarah whispered. Mark looked up at the security camera in the corner. The red power light was blinking. The camera was rotating directly toward them. The motorized whir was tiny but distinct in the silence of the archives. They had cameras everywhere. They had systems everywhere. "We have to move," Sarah said. At 10:15 p.m., Sarah's old Volvo cut through the rain-soaked streets toward the bridge that led out of town. Her hands gripped the steering wheel. Rain lashed the windshield. The wipers moved rhythmically. In the distance, a line of blue and red flashing lights blocked the bridge. Police cruisers positioned to seal the exit. Mark was in the passenger seat. The briefcase was on his lap. He checked the cellular signal on his phone. No service. The cellular towers had been jammed. The city had resources. The city had connections. Sarah slammed the car into reverse. The tires screamed on the wet pavement. The back end of the Volvo swung wildly across 2 lanes. She performed a violent J-turn, pointing the car in the opposite direction. Behind them, a police car swerved to follow, its siren a deafening wail. Sarah steered the car into a narrow, unlit construction bypass. The car bounced violently over metal plates. Bang, 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 each impact sending a shock wave through Mark's spine. Blinding flashes lit up the rearview mirror. More sirens. Sarah spotted a gap in a chain-link fence. She floored the accelerator. The car smashed through the fence, the metal wires screaming as it scraped the side of the Volvo. Sparks flew in long arcs. They disappeared into the dark construction site. The police lights faded behind them. The North Boise water treatment plant sprawled across 10 acres of concrete, pipes, and massive holding tanks. Mark and Sarah parked Sarah's Volvo in the woods a half-mile away and approached on foot. It was 11:30 p.m. when Mark reached the outflow pipe, a massive concrete structure that emptied directly into the treatment system. He stood over the outflow, holding his phone. He was streaming live. In his other hand, he held a glass vial of water. The liquid was tinged a sickly, neon yellow under his flashlight. "Look at it," Mark said into the phone, his voice trembling. "This is what you're drinking. This is what killed my father." A heavy boot slammed into his ribs. Mark sprawled toward the edge of the concrete basin. Chief Miller stood over him in full uniform, a heavy service baton extended. "You think this is over?" Miller said. Mark lunged from the ground, wrapping his arms around Miller's knees. They both tumbled into the shallow, chemical-laden runoff. Mark's face was pressed into the stinging, yellow water. His eyes burned. His throat burned. Miller pinned Mark down, his forearm across Mark's throat. He was pushing Mark's head under the surface. Mark's hands clawed at Miller's eyes. His lungs were screaming. Air bubbles rose toward the surface. His vision was distorted, yellow and blurred. Mark found a heavy discarded pipe wrench in the silt. He swung it upward, catching Miller in the shoulder with a sickening crunch. Miller rolled off, howling in pain. Mark broke the surface, gasping, coughing. Yellow liquid poured from his nose and mouth. He stumbled toward the control room. The glass-walled control room was lit by emergency lighting. Red strobes pulsed against the darkness. Mark was drenched in yellow chemicals, dripping, gasping. He reached for the main purge lever, but his hand stopped when he saw who was sitting in the command chair. Councilman Reed, the man who had hired Mark as a janitor 15 years ago. The man who'd given him steady work when no one else would employ someone with Mark's history. Reed stood up. He was holding a suppressed pistol aimed at Mark's chest. The ledger was on the desk beside him. "You shouldn't have looked," Reed said quietly. He tossed a photograph onto the console. A Polaroid. Faded colors. It showed a young Reed and Mark's father standing together in front of the plant. They weren't enemies in the photo. They were partners. Partners in what? Mark couldn't tell. But their body language was clear. "Your father didn't refuse the money, Mark," Reed said, his voice clinical, devastating. "He came up with the plan. He only got betrayed when he tried to double the price." Mark looked at the ledger. He'd held it in his hands for hours. He'd read that sentence a dozen times. "I refused the money. They said they'd make me disappear like the data." But those weren't words of honor. Those were negotiation tactics, handwriting games. His father wasn't a hero refusing corruption. His father was a businessman trying to extract more payment. Reed pressed a button on the console. "Delete all data" appeared on the screen in bold white letters. He hovered his finger over yes. He looked at Mark with pity. "Your father played a dangerous game," Reed continued. "He lost. Now you're playing the same game, and you're about to lose too." Mark was forced onto his knees on the balcony, overlooking the dark, swirling water of the reservoir. Reed held the gun to the back of Mark's head. Rain drummed on the metal roof. The vast water stretched below, black and unknowable. Mark looked down at his hand. He was still clutching his father's wedding ring, which he'd found in a hidden compartment of the briefcase. He saw the inscription inside. "Truth above all." Reed's finger began to squeeze the trigger. The hammer moved back slowly. Click, click. The metallic clicks of a gun preparing to fire filled the world. Mark's mind cleared. Even if his father was a liar, even if the story he'd been telling himself for decades was a fiction, the people of the city were still drinking poison. Children were still getting sick. That part was real. That part was still happening. The gun pressed harder against his skull. Then, a spotlight blazed from the darkness of the catwalk. Blinding white light. Reed's gun wavered. He shielded his eyes, temporarily blind. Sarah appeared at the end of the catwalk, holding a high-lumen tactical flashlight. Beside her was a hunched man in a janitor's uniform, Old Man Arthur, who'd worked at the plant 30 years ago before he disappeared. The rumors were he'd been killed for knowing too much. But there he was, alive. Arthur held up a digital tablet. "It's already out," he shouted. Mark's dropped phone, still transmitting from the floor of the control room, had been broadcasting to the world. The viewer count climbed. 100,000, 200,000, 300,000. 500,000 people watching. "I didn't just hide the case, Reed," Arthur said, his voice gravelly and satisfied. "I mirrored the servers 20 years ago. You're done." Reed screamed in rage and fired toward Arthur. Mark lunged, grabbing a high-pressure chemical fire hose from the wall bracket. He cranked the valve open. The hose leaped like a snake. Air hissed from the nozzle, then a massive roar of pressurized water erupted from the opening. A jet of high-pressure fire-smothering foam blasted Reed, knocking him off his feet. The force pinned him against the railing. The gun was swept away by the white torrent. Reed flailed, choking, his body battered by the relentless pressure. Mark dropped the hose and tackled Reed, using a pair of heavy-duty industrial zip ties from his janitor's belt to bind Reed's hands behind his back. Zip, snap. The zip ties tightened. Reed was restrained, helpless. At 1:30 a.m., Mark sat on the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a gray shock blanket. State police escorted Mayor Miller and Councilman Reed in handcuffs toward waiting vehicles. Flashbulbs popped like tiny stars. Reporters shouted questions that no one answered. Sarah walked up and handed Mark a small, sealed envelope that had been found in a secret compartment of the briefcase. "He wanted you to have this," she said. Mark opened it. Inside was a life insurance policy from 1994. In the beneficiary line, Mark Peterson. Below it, a handwritten note in his father's elegant cursive. "I'm playing a dangerous game to make sure you never have to work a broom, Mark. I'm sorry." The irony was bitter. Mark had spent 14 years working with a broom, cleaning mirrors, scrubbing floors, watching powerful men pass through the halls of the school where his father's crime had been buried. Mark looked at his hands. Yellow stains, calluses from years of work. He looked at his reflection in the ambulance window. He smiled a small, bitter smile. The yellow stains on his face were starting to wash away in the rain. "The mess is finally clean, Dad," Mark whispered. He stood up and dropped the blanket. He picked up his yellow crowbar from the site, the same tool that had started this entire trajectory hours ago. He walked away from the cameras, away from the flashing lights, toward the dawn light breaking over the Boise hills. The sun was rising. Pink and gold light flooded across the hills. Birds were beginning to chirp. Mark's footsteps echoed on the concrete. Behind him, the water treatment facility was being sealed by police tape. Evidence markers were being placed. The machinery of justice was beginning its slow, deliberate work. Mark didn't look back.